11. Sovereignty, government, and providence. Before discussing the meaning of sovereignty, government, and providence in relationship to the triune God, it is wise to understand what we mean by these words. It is also important that we see these words, not abstractly, but theologically. If God be indeed the creator of all things must be defined in relationship to Him, or else we have a false definition. Samuel Hopkins, 1721 to 1803, wrote thus of sovereignty. When I speak of God's acting in a sovereign way, I do not mean that He acts above or without all reason and motive, or merely because He wills. For God never acts so in any instance whatsoever. Such sovereignty and arbitrariness is in no case to be ascribed to God, for this would be to dishonour and reproach Him as acting without any wisdom or holiness. The sovereignty of God consists in His being above all obligation to His creatures, and so infinitely above any direction, influence, and control from them in anything that He does. In this sense, God is an infinite sovereign. He does just as He pleases, not being influenced by any obligation He is under to anyone, any further than He has been pleased to oblige Himself by promise or some other way. Sovereignty is, therefore, in a peculiar manner, essential to all acts of grace, for grace, in all cases, is sovereign grace, and what is not so is not grace at all. For whatever good is bestowed, if he that grants it is under any original obligation to do it, or is obliged to do it from the reason and nature of things, and so owed it to him that receives it, it is only an act of justice, and the nature of paying a debt, and there is no grace in it. For grace is free, unobliged, undeserved favour, and that which is not so is not grace. In the case before us, God acts in the highest sense and degree as a sovereign, He being not only under no obligation to grant such a favour to anyone when He does it, but there is in the sinner something infinitely contrary to this, even infinite unworthiness of the favour granted, and desert of infinite evil. Therefore, whenever God changes and regenerates the heart of a sinner, He does what He was under no sort of obligation to the sinner to do, but might justly leave him to the hardness of his own heart to perish in his sin forever. So that God, in determining to whom He will grant this infinite favour, and in giving it to some, and withholding it from others, has mercy on whom He will have mercy, and whom He will He hardeneth. What the sinner does before he is regenerated does not lay God under any degree of obligation to him by promise or any other way, for he complies with none of God's commands or offers in the least degree. God is sovereign because He is the creator of all things. He is He who is, the Lord. As Stephen Charnock, 1628 to 1680, wrote so clearly, there is no succession in the knowledge of God. The variety of successions and changes in the world make not succession, or new objects in the divine mind, for all things are present to Him from eternity in regard of His knowledge, though they are not actually present in the world in regard to their existence. He doth not know one thing now and another anon. He seeth all things at once. Known unto God are all things from the beginning of the world. Acts chapter 15, verse 18. But in their true order of succession, as they lie in the eternal counsel of God, to be brought forth in time. Though there be a succession and order of things as they are wrought, there is no succession of God, to be brought forth in time. God is His own eternity. He is not eternal by grant and the disposal of any other, but by nature and essence. The eternity of God is nothing else but the duration of God, and the duration of God is nothing else but His existence enduring. If eternity were anything distinct from God, and not of the essence of God, then there would be something which was not God, necessary to perfect God. God is essentially whatsoever he is, and there is nothing in God but his essence. God hath life in himself. John chapter 5, verse 26. The Father hath life in himself. He is the living God. Therefore, steadfast forever. Daniel chapter 6, verse 26. He hath life by his essence, not by participation. With this in mind, remembering that only God is or can be sovereign, let us look at government. Government is the act of governing, of exercising control and authority. Government is thus an exercise of sovereignty, or else a power delegated by sovereignty. Paul says plainly that there is no power but of God. Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Using for power the word exousia, meaning absolute, unrestricted freedom of action and rule in God, delegated by him as he chooses. The New Testament uses two words translated as government: kubernesis, to guide, pilot or steer, and kuriotes, lordship, dominion. Sovereignty and government are thus very obviously theological facts, if Scripture is to be believed. Thus, for a theologian to discuss the doctrine of God without dealing with the usurpations of humanistic civil governments and schools is to deny God. It is impossible to discuss the doctrine of God in an ecclesiastical vacuum. God is not a mere idea after the Greeks. He is the living Lord and maker of all things, and a consuming fire. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29. Those who fail to see the implications of sovereignty and government do not know the living God. The secular historian Baumer, in speaking of the rise of absolutism in the modern era, clearly sees its connection to the rise also of the doctrine of statist sovereignty. First the monarchs, and then parliaments, became the sovereign authority in society. Hegel openly viewed the state as God walking on earth in his political theology, and still the church slumbered on. The Marxists exclude any sovereignty in government outside of the Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat, and the theologians talk of dialogues with such men. Now let us turn to Providence. Berkhoff gave a good, brief statement of the doctrine. With its doctrine of providence, the Church took position against both the Epicurean notion that the world is governed by chance and the Stoic view that it is ruled by fate. From the very start, theologians took the position that God preserves and governs the world. Due to the close connection between the two, the history of the doctrine of providence follows, in the main, that of the doctrine of predestination. Providence may be defined as that continued exercise of the divine energy whereby the Creator preserves all his creatures, is operative in all that comes to pass in the world, and directs all things to their appointed ends. This definition indicates that there are three elements in providence, namely, preservation, conservatio, sustentatio, concurrence or cooperation, concursus, cooperatio, and government, gubernatio. The providence of God is little spoken of today because his powers of government have been transferred to the state and to man, together with his sovereignty. It is the state that today preaches providence to willing congregations, calling it cradle to grave or womb to tomb care, social security, and a variety of other names. Men everywhere believe in providence, and they look to their gods for it. Unhappily, their gods are false gods, and not the living Lord. Berkhoff summarized very ably with supporting texts, the providential control and government of God over every area of life, from inanimate to the animate, over things great and small, over things seemingly insignificant or accidental, and over heaven, hell, and earth. This writer does not intend to cover the same grounds as Berkhoff and urges that he be read. What does it mean, then, to believe in sovereignty, government, and providence as a Christian? It means that my life and being are under the sovereignty and government of the all-wise and most holy Trinity, whose ordering, preserving, and government of all things is for his own purpose and glory, and that my only joy and purpose is to acknowledge that sovereign, governing providence, and to rest in its sufficiency. It means that, in every area of life, I must acknowledge and establish rule, law, and authority only in terms of his law-word and in faithfulness to his kingship. This means that, in every area of life and thought, I must assert the crown rights of Christ the King and bring all things into captivity to him. The alternative to the sovereignty, government, and providence of the triune God is, in practice, the sovereignty, government, and providence of church, state, or some agency of man. It means freedom from God for the slavery of sin and rebellion. The man who is in revolt against God's reign will soon be the slave, not only of sin, but of apostate institutions, churches, states, families, men, women, and children. For such a slave, freedom is intolerable. As a young Nazi boasted just before World War II, "We are free of freedom." But man's revolution against God does not abolish or dismantle God's reign. It only unleashes his judgment. The theologian who believes in God's sovereignty, government, and providence must challenge the things which are, the humanistic usurpers of God's honour. Theology is not a classroom subject, but a battle line cause. This fact the theologians of statism, more commonly known as political scientists, have seen, but the church theologians have not seen. In a sinful world, at war with God, and in rebellion against his law, a biblical theology is a declaration of war and a call to battle. Samuel Hopkins had this to say of providence: "This care and providence of God, in directing and governing all creatures and things, is universal and constant, respecting all things at all times, and is extended to the least as well as the greatest and more important existence, and is concerned in every event, however minute, and in our view inconsiderable. Not a sparrow or the least bird or insect falls to the ground or dies without the direction and agency of God. The hairs of our head are all carefully numbered, and so many, and not one more are ordered to exist, and not one is removed or broken without the order and operation of the divine hand. And this is equally true of every hair on men and beasts, and of each leaf in the forest, or spire of grass in the earth that ever have existed or will exist to the end of the world." Deuteronomy chapter 28 tells us how God's government moves against a faithless people, and also how he blesses his covenant race. If our trust and obedience is in God's sovereign government and providence, we may suffer at the hands of men, but we are under the guiding, protecting hand of God, who chooses our inheritance for us. Psalm 47, verse 4, and guides and directs us in terms of it. There is no safety except in our God, nor any government, as Hopkins wrote. How safe and happy are they who put their trust in God, he who directs and governs all things, and orders every event, who is infinitely above all control, on whom all things entirely depend, who does whatsoever he pleases in heaven and among the children of men on earth. He is engaged by repeated promises to them that no evil shall come near them to hurt them, but that everything shall work together for their good. If God be thus for them, who or what can be against them? The Lord reigneth. Let them who trust in him always rejoice. Well may they say, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will we not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. O Lord of hosts, blessed is the man that trusteth in thee. When sovereignty is claimed by the state then seeks to remake man and the world. It assumes the central and sovereign task of government, and therefore of providence. The result is nominal and disappearing churchianity, and the steady replacement thereof with a political religion. Men look then to the state to provide. Providence becomes a political, not a Christian article of faith. To affirm the sovereignty of God means to deny the sovereignty, government, and providence of man, the state, the church, and all other man-made agencies. Their only role is to obey God as defined by God's word. All else is usurpation and sin